The doors of the sorting hall slammed shut behind me before I even understood what was happening, and the sound echoed through my chest like a second heartbeat. I was the last name called. Not because I arrived late, not because I lost my papers or slept through my wake call. I was called last because the officer holding the list looked at me, looked at the aliens standing on either side of me, and decided I did not belong anywhere near the front. My name is Ethan Hale, and on that day, I stood at the very end of a line that stretched across the widest room I had ever seen, surrounded by beings who could crush stone with a closed fist. I still remembered the transport ride that brought me here, 3 days earlier, crammed into a narrow seat built for a species with a longer spine than mine, watching the stars blur past a small viewport, while an automated voice listed rules I was too nervous to fully absorb. I had left a small farming town behind, said goodbye to my grandfather at a dusty landing strip, and carried with me nothing but a single bag and a lifetime of being told I was too small for the things I wanted to do. None of that mattered anymore. What mattered now was the room in front of me. The hall itself was built for giants. The ceiling rose so high that the lights near the top looked like distant stars. Metal beams the size of tree trunks held up a roof that seemed to breathe with the hum of some far-off engine. Every step I took across the polished floor sent a small echo bouncing back at me, as if the room itself was measuring how small I was compared to everyone else inside it. There were maybe 200 of us that day, new cadets. All of us pulled from different corners of known space to train at the Outer Combine Academy, a place built by an alliance of species that had decided, after years of quiet distance, to finally train their young together instead of apart. I was one of the first 3 humans ever accepted. The other 2 stood somewhere near the middle of the line, and I could not even see their faces from where I stood, though I would meet one of them properly before the day was finished. Around me were shapes I had only seen in old data files back on Earth. A being with skin like cracked granite stood 2 rows ahead, arms as thick as my entire body. Beside him, a creature covered in deep blue scales flexed clawed fingers that could probably tear through a starship hull without much effort. Somewhere further up, I heard a low rumbling laugh that shook the floor tiles under my boots. Further still, near the very front of the line, a slender being with 4 thin legs and a long neck stood perfectly still, watching everything around it with unblinking patience, as though it had already decided the entire event was beneath its notice. I did not feel scared. I want to say that clearly, because a lot of people expect fear to be the first thing a person like me should feel in a room like that. What I actually felt was something closer to quiet interest, the same feeling I used to get standing at the edge of a wrestling mat back home, waiting for my name to be called against someone twice my size. An officer walked down the line with a data pad glowing pale blue in her hand. She had 4 eyes, 2 large and 2 small, and she used all of them at once, scanning height, muscle mass, bone density, and reflex speed as she passed each of us. When she reached me, she paused for exactly 2 seconds. I remember counting them. I remember, too, the small sound she made under her breath, something between a sigh and a click of disappointment, as if my presence on her list was an inconvenience she had been warned about but hoped would somehow resolve itself before she arrived. Then she moved on without saying a word, and a small mark appeared at the very bottom of the ranking display floating above the hall. Human, Ethan Hale, rank 212, last. A few nearby cadets noticed the mark blink into place and turned to look at me. One of them, a tall being with pale violet skin and no visible nose, tilted his head the way a curious animal might when it sees something it does not understand. "That is the whole rank," he said, more to himself than to me. "That is not a mistake." I did not answer him. There was nothing useful to say yet. Back home, coaches taught me one thing that stuck harder than anything else. Never waste your voice explaining yourself before people have even seen what you can do. Let the moment speak first. He introduced himself anyway, apparently unable to stand in silence for long. His name was something long and layered with clicking sounds I could not fully repeat, and he told me, almost apologetically, that most cadets simply called him Vay for convenience. Vay explained, in a low and steady voice, that he came from a world where climbing was the primary form of movement, which explained the long, thin fingers curling loosely at his sides. He asked me, with what I could only describe as genuine curiosity rather than cruelty, whether humans always trained this poorly, or whether I was simply an unfortunate example. "You will see," I told him, and left it there. A soft chime rang out across the hall, and every conversation dropped into silence. At the very front, on a raised platform built from dark metal, stood a woman I would come to know as Commander Elena Frost, head instructor of the new cadet intake. She was human too, though she had spent most of her career serving alongside species that could snap her spine without trying. There was a calm confidence in the way she held herself that made the whole hall settle before she even spoke. "Welcome," she said, her voice carried across the room by hidden speakers built into the walls. "You have been placed today according to raw data, height, mass, strength readings, species averages pulled from 1,000 years of recorded combat history." She paused, letting her eyes drift slowly across the crowd. "This ranking means nothing yet," she continued. "It is only a guess. Today, we test that guess." A low murmur rippled through the hall. I felt my pulse pick up slightly, not from fear, but from that same old itch I used to get before a match. The itch that said something was about to happen, and I needed to be ready for it. "The first trial of this academy has been the same for over 200 cycles," Commander Frost said. "It is called the immovable stance. Each cadet will step into the marked circle at the center of this hall. Our strongest current cadet will attempt, using any technique they choose within safety limits, to move that cadet out of the circle. Push, pull, lift. It does not matter, as long as no serious harm comes to either side." She gestured toward a wide ring of pale light glowing on the floor, easily large enough to hold 3 or 4 of the biggest creatures in the room at once. "Those who hold their ground earn respect that no datapad can measure. Those who do not learn exactly where they stand, and exactly how much work lies ahead of them." I glanced down the line toward the front of the hall, and that was the first time I saw him. He stood near the platform, already separated from the rest of us, because he did not need to be sorted. Everyone in that hall already knew his name. Korath Dax, reigning champion of the immovable stance for 3 cycles running. Born on a world called Thren where the gravity alone was almost double what most species considered survivable. His people grew up crushed under their own planet's weight from the moment they could walk, and by adulthood, their bodies turned into something closer to living machinery than flesh and bone. Korath stood taller than anyone else in the hall, his shoulders wide enough to block a doorway, his arms corded with muscle that shifted like coiled rope every time he moved. His skin had a dark gray tone, rough like old stone, and 2 short ridges ran along his jaw, where a human might have a beard. He did not look at the crowd. He did not need to. He simply waited, arms crossed, the way a mountain waits for weather to pass. "They usually save him for last," Vey whispered, apparently unable to stay quiet for long. "One trial each cycle where they let the lowest-ranked cadet go up against him first. Everyone knows how it ends." I looked at the glowing circle on the floor, then back at Korath, then finally down at my own hands. Ordinary hands. No claws, no stone-like skin. Just calloused palms from years of training on a mat that smelled like sweat and rubber, back on a planet most of these beings probably could not find on a star chart without help. "Cadets will be called in reverse rank order," Commander Frost announced. "Highest number first." My stomach did not drop. If anything, it settled, the way it always did, right before a match started. There is a strange kind of peace that comes from finally knowing exactly what is expected of you, even when what is expected of you looks impossible from the outside. Rank 212. Last place. My number. I would be the very last cadet to step into that circle, against the very cadet nobody in that hall had ever managed to move. The first name called belonged to a broad, 6-legged creature covered in thick plating, ranked somewhere near the middle of the pack. He walked into the circle with a low growl building in his throat, clearly trying to convince himself as much as anyone watching. Korath uncrossed his arms, stepped forward without any wasted movement, placed one massive hand flat against the creature's plated chest, and pushed. The 6-legged cadet slid backward across the smooth floor as if the ground itself had turned to ice beneath him, out of the circle in under 2 seconds. A ripple of quiet laughter rolled through parts of the crowd, quickly silenced by a sharp look from Commander Frost. One after another, cadets walked into that circle. Some braced themselves with wide stances. Some tried to grip Korath's arms and resist with everything they had. A few used species-specific techniques, twisting their bodies at odd angles to try and find some kind of leverage. A pale, 4-armed cadet attempted to root himself by digging small barbs from his palms into the floor itself, only to be lifted, barbs and all, straight out of the circle with a wet tearing sound that made several nearby cadets wince. None of it mattered. Korath moved each of them with an ease that started to feel almost cruel, though his face never showed a hint of enjoyment or effort. He simply did what needed doing, over and over, like a machine completing a checklist. I watched every single trial from my place at the very back of the line, cataloging small details the way my old coach taught me. How Korath planted his feet before each push, How his weight shifted forward from his hips, not his shoulders. How he wasted almost no motion, every push aimed with the kind of precision that only comes from doing the exact same thing thousands of times before. I noticed too a pattern in how he adjusted his grip depending on whether an opponent tried to twist away or plant straight down, always finding the correct answer within a second or two, as though his body kept a private library of solutions for every kind of resistance. He was strong, without question, but strength, on its own, has always had a weakness that most people forget to look for. Strength likes to solve every problem the same way. Hours passed. The line in front of me grew shorter and shorter, cadet after cadet stepping into that circle and stepping right back out of it seconds later, some frustrated, some embarrassed, a few openly relieved that the trial had finally ended without any real harm. Vey went at some point in the middle of the line, and though his long limbs gave him an unusual, almost graceful stance, Korath ended his attempt in under 4 seconds, sending him sliding gently to the edge of the circle with barely more than a light shove. Eventually, only a handful of cadets remained ahead of me. A creature with 4 arms tried wrapping all of them around Korath's midsection, straining with a sound like grinding gears, only to be lifted clean off the ground and set down outside the ring, almost gently, as if Korath was placing down something fragile rather than defeating an opponent. Then it was down to 3 cadets, then 2, then 1. Then, finally, the hall fell quiet, and Commander Frost's voice rang out one last time. Ethan Hale, rank 212. Every head in that massive hall turned toward the back of the line, toward me, the smallest and least impressive shape among 200 cadets pulled from 100 different worlds. Someone near the front let out a short laugh, quickly stifled. Others simply stared, the way people stare at something they expect to end quickly and forgettably. I did not rush. I did not hesitate either. I walked forward, past rows of towering bodies that parted just slightly to let me through, my boots striking the polished floor in a steady rhythm that matched my own heartbeat. Vey watched me pass with an expression that had shifted somewhere between pity and genuine curiosity, though he said nothing this time. Korath watched me approach with an expression I could not quite read. Not mockery exactly, something closer to mild curiosity, the way a person might glance at a small stone lying in the middle of a road they are about to walk across without slowing down. I stepped into the circle of pale light, feeling its edge hum faintly beneath my boots, and turned to face him directly for the very first time. He was easily twice my height. His shadow alone seemed to swallow the space around me. Somewhere behind me, I heard Vey mutter something under his breath that sounded a lot like a prayer. Commander Frost raised one hand toward the 2 of us. Last trial of the day, she announced, her voice carrying an edge of curiosity now, as if even she was not entirely sure what would happen next. Cadet Hale, Cadet Dax, begin whenever you are ready. I planted my feet shoulder-width apart, bent my knees slightly, and dropped my center of gravity, the exact way my old coach drilled into me 1,000 times on a mat half a world away. My hands settled loosely at my sides, ready, calm, patient. Korath studied me for one more long second, then finally moved, closing the distance between us in 2 easy strides, his open palm rising toward my chest with the same casual confidence that had already ended 211 trials before mine. I did not move. His hand met my chest. And nothing happened. I felt the impact of his palm against my chest, a heavy pressure that would have sent most of the cadets who went before me sliding across the floor, and I did not move, not an inch. Not a centimeter. My boots stayed exactly where I had planted them, my knees still bent, my breath still steady. For a moment, the entire hall seemed to forget how to make noise. Korath blinked. It was such a small movement, but on his stone-like face it looked enormous, a crack of surprise breaking through an expression that had not changed once during the previous 211 trials. He pulled his hand back, glanced down at it as if checking it was still attached to his arm, then looked at me again. Again. Commander Frost said from the platform, her voice sharper now, cutting through the silence like a blade. She had leaned forward slightly, both hands braced against the rail in front of her. Korath planted his feet wider this time, the way I had seen him do only once before, against the 4-armed cadet who had wrapped himself around his midsection. He reached forward with both hands, gripping my shoulders, and pushed with his full weight behind it. I felt it in my bones. My teeth clenched, my shoes scraped very slightly against the floor, maybe half a centimeter of movement, no more. Then I found my footing again, dug in, and held. A murmur rolled through the crowd, low and confused, like a wave that could not decide which direction to travel. I heard someone near the front say something in a language I did not understand, followed by a sound that could only be surprise. Somewhere behind me, Vay's long neck craned forward so far I half expected him to lose his own balance. Korath let go of my shoulders and stepped back, studying me the way a person studies a puzzle that suddenly refuses to fit together the way it always had before. His chest rose and fell slightly faster than it had a minute earlier, though I doubted anyone else in the hall noticed that small detail. I noticed it. I had spent years learning to read exactly that kind of thing in an opponent. "You are human," he said. It was not a question. His voice was low and rough, like stone grinding against stone, carrying easily across the now silent hall. "That is what it says on my file," I answered. A few cadets laughed, quiet and nervous, quickly cut short by the tension still hanging thick in the air. Korath did not laugh. He tilted his head slightly, studying me the way a hunter studies unfamiliar tracks in unfamiliar terrain. "Your species rank shows soft bodies," he said. "Weak bones, slow muscle response compared to most recorded species." "I have heard that before," I said, keeping my voice even and calm. Commander Frost stepped down from the platform, walking toward the edge of the circle with quick, purposeful steps. I could see the sharp focus in her eyes, the look of someone recalculating everything they thought they understood about the two people standing in front of her. Behind her, two other instructors had already begun whispering to each other, one of them tapping rapidly at a datapad, clearly pulling up historical records none of us could see. "Cadet Dax," she said, "you are permitted to use approved techniques beyond a standard push. Full clearance granted for this trial only." Korath nodded once, rolling his shoulders back, the muscles along his arms shifting and tightening beneath his rough gray skin. I recognized the change in his stance immediately. He was no longer treating this like an easy formality tucked at the end of a long day. He was treating it like an actual contest, maybe for the first time since he arrived at this academy. I did not step back. I did not loosen my stance. If anything, I felt something settle deeper inside me, a steady, familiar calm that used to arrive right before the biggest matches of my life, back when I was young and small, and constantly told I did not belong on the mat with the bigger kids. My grandfather used to say something to me before every one of those matches, kneeling down so his eyes were level with mine, his rough farmer's hands resting on my shoulders. He would say that size tells you how much a person weighs, but it never tells you how much they can carry. I did not fully understand what he meant back then. I understood it a little better standing in that circle, facing down a being built by a planet that seemed determined to crush anything soft enough to survive on its surface. Korath shifted his weight low, dropping into a stance that mirrored my own, bending his knees, widening his base, lowering his center of gravity the way heavier fighters do when they finally respect the person standing across from them. It was the first time all day he had bothered to prepare properly for an opponent. "Begin," Commander Frost said. This time, Korath did not simply reach for me. He circled slightly to my left, testing my footing, watching how I adjusted to match him. I turned with him, small steps, keeping my base steady, refusing to give him an angle he could use. He lunged suddenly, wrapping both arms around my waist in a move built to lift and remove an opponent from the circle entirely, a technique that had clearly worked on every single cadet who came before me that day. I felt my feet leave the ground for a fraction of a second, my stomach lurching upward with the sudden shift in gravity, the crowd gasping as one. Then my weight settled, and something in the way I twisted my hips at exactly the right moment brought my feet back down inside the circle, planted wide, anchored low, refusing the lift entirely. It was not magic. It was not some hidden power. It was 12 years of drilling the exact same defense against bigger opponents, over and over, on a mat back home, until my body knew how to respond before my mind had even finished processing the threat. Korath grunted, adjusting his grip, trying again. I felt the strain building through my shoulders and back, a deep burning ache that spread down into my thighs as I fought to keep my center of gravity low and stable against a creature who outweighed me by what must have been 3 or 4 times my own body weight. The crowd had gone completely silent now, every cadet in that massive hall leaning forward slightly, watching a contest that should have ended in less than 2 seconds, still somehow ongoing well past a full minute. Korath released his grip and stepped back again, breathing harder now, sweat beginning to bead along the rough ridges of his forehead. I straightened slowly, rolling my shoulders, feeling the ache settle into my muscles but refusing to let it show on my face. "How?" he said quietly, more to himself than to me. "Does something your size hold against that?" I thought about answering him honestly. I thought about explaining the years of training, the countless mornings spent on a cold mat before school, the losses that hurt worse than any bruise ever could, the slow and painful process of learning that leverage and timing could sometimes matter more than raw size. But I decided the moment was not right for a long explanation. Some things are better shown than told. You have not tried everything yet, I said instead. Something flickered behind Korath's eyes, an expression that looked almost like respect, though I could not be entirely sure given how unfamiliar his face still was to me. He nodded slowly, then turned toward Commander Frost. Requesting permission for full technique clearance, he said, Level 2. A ripple of tension moved through the crowd at those words. I did not know exactly what Level 2 clearance meant yet, but judging by the way even some of the largest cadets in the hall shifted uncomfortably at the announcement, I understood it was not a small request. Commander Frost studied Korath for a long moment, then turned her attention to me, her eyes narrowing slightly as she took in my stance, my breathing, the small details that told her more about my condition than any datapad could measure. Cadet Hale, she said, do you wish to withdraw from this trial? No shame follows a withdrawal at this stage. I felt every eye in that hall settle on me at once, waiting for my answer. I thought of my grandfather kneeling in front of me before every match of my childhood. I thought of the coach back home who never once let me quit early, even when quitting would have been easier and far less painful. I thought of the small mark that had appeared beneath my name that morning, ranked last among 212 cadets pulled from across the stars. I straightened my back, settled deeper into my stance, and looked directly at Commander Frost. I am staying in the circle, I said. A quiet murmur moved through the crowd again, different this time, carrying something that almost sounded like approval mixed with disbelief. Commander Frost held my gaze for one more second, then nodded slowly, and stepped back toward the edge of the circle. Level 2 clearance granted, she announced, her voice carrying clearly across the hall. Proceed when ready, Cadet Dax. Korath rolled his neck, cracked his knuckles with a sound like stones grinding together, and settled into a new stance, lower and wider than before, the kind of preparation I imagined he reserved for opponents who actually deserved his full attention. I planted my feet once more, steadied my breathing, and waited. Korath moved faster than anything his size had any right to move. 1 second he stood a full stride away from me, settled low into his new stance. The next second his hands were already closing around my forearms, his grip tightening with enough force that I felt the pressure travel straight through to the bone. I did not have time to think. I only had time to react, dropping my weight lower, digging my heels against the smooth floor, refusing to let my balance tip forward. He pulled hard, trying to drag me clean off my feet the same way he had ended nearly every trial that day, using pure force to override whatever stance an opponent had chosen. My arms burned instantly, a sharp fire spreading from my wrists up through my shoulders. I gritted my teeth and held my ground, feeling my boots scrape a thin groove into the polished floor beneath me. The crowd around the circle had gone completely silent again, the kind of silence that feels heavier than noise ever could. Somewhere behind me, I heard someone whisper a single word in a language I did not recognize, but the tone told me everything I needed to know. Disbelief. Korath released my arms and shifted his grip lower, wrapping one massive hand around my waist and using the other to press down against my shoulder. Trying a new angle meant to fold my body forward and break my footing entirely. I felt my spine curve under the pressure, my thighs screaming as I fought to keep my knees bent and my hips locked in place. For a brief moment, my left foot slid backward, just barely, no more than a few centimeters. A sound rippled through the crowd, somewhere between a gasp and a cheer, cut short almost immediately when my foot found the floor again and held firm, still well within the glowing edge of the circle. Korath grunted, low and frustrated, a sound I had not heard from him even once during the previous 211 trials. Sweat now ran freely down the ridges of his forehead, dripping onto the floor between us. His breathing had grown heavier, sharper, each exhale carrying a faint growl that I suspected was more instinct than intention. I thought about my grandfather again, kneeling in front of me on a cold morning years ago, the smell of hay and diesel fuel drifting through the barn behind him. He used to tell me that the biggest opponent in any match was never the person standing across from you. It was always the voice inside your own head telling you to give up before your body actually reached its limit. I had heard that voice plenty of times over the years. I had learned, slowly and painfully, how to ignore it. Korath adjusted his grip again, this time locking both arms fully around my torso in a crushing hold meant to lift me straight off the ground. My ribs strained against the pressure, my breath forced out in short, sharp bursts. I felt my feet leave the floor for a fraction of a second, my stomach dropping with the sudden shift, the crowd erupting into a wave of noise that quickly died back down when my knees bent sharply, and my full weight dropped straight down through my heels the moment my feet touched the ground again. The technique worked exactly the way my old coach had drilled it into me, over and over, on countless mornings when I complained that my body ached too much to keep practicing. Sudden weight drops beat sustained lifts almost every time, as long as your timing landed correctly. My timing landed correctly. Korath staggered slightly, adjusting his footing, clearly caught off guard by how much force it took to keep me suspended even for that brief moment. He released his hold and stepped back, chest heaving, his rough gray skin now slick with sweat under the bright lights of the hall. "You train like this," he said between breaths, not quite a question, more like he was trying to convince himself of something he still did not fully believe. "Every day. Since you were small." "Every day," I confirmed, my own breathing ragged now, my arms trembling faintly from the sustained strain, though I refused to let that show in my stance. Even the days I did not want to. Something shifted in his expression again, that same flicker of respect I had noticed earlier, now settling into something steadier. I realized, watching him, that this contest had stopped being about proving a point for him somewhere in the last minute. It had become something closer to genuine curiosity, maybe even the beginning of something like admiration, buried under exhaustion and stubborn pride. Commander Frost stepped closer to the edge of the circle, her eyes moving rapidly between the two of us, clearly recalculating everything she had assumed about this trial before it began. Around her, other instructors had gathered as well, drawn by the noise and the unusual length of the contest, murmuring quietly among themselves as they watched. 2 minutes, one of them said, glancing down at a datapad in her hand, her voice carrying just enough surprise that everyone nearby heard it clearly. "No cadet has lasted this long against Korath Dax in 3 full cycles." I heard the words, but I did not let them change my focus. My legs ached with a deep, burning fatigue that I recognized from the longest matches of my life, the kind of ache that settles into your bones and whispers that stopping would be so much easier than continuing. I ignored it the same way I always had, breathing slowly through my nose, resetting my stance, waiting for whatever Korath planned to try next. He rolled his shoulders back, cracked his neck once more, and settled into yet another stance, wider still, lower than before. I recognized something new in the way he moved this time, a kind of focused intensity that told me he was no longer holding anything back, treating me the way he might treat an opponent he genuinely respected, rather than a formality he expected to finish quickly. "Requesting full clearance," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. "Level 3. A sharp murmur rolled through the crowd at those words, louder this time, several cadets exchanging worried glances. I noticed Commander Frost hesitate, her jaw tightening slightly before she responded. "Level 3 clearance has not been granted during a first cycle trial in over 40 years, she said, her voice measured and careful. "Cadet Dax, are you certain this is necessary?" Korath did not look away from me as he answered. "He has not moved," he said simply. "I have tried everything I know at lower levels. If there is more to learn here, I would rather learn it properly." I felt a strange kind of warmth settle in my chest at those words, something unexpected given the exhaustion pulling at every muscle in my body. It was not mockery in his voice anymore. It was something closer to genuine respect, the kind that only grows between two people who have actually tested each other honestly. Commander Frost turned toward me, her expression serious now, all traces of formality gone from her voice. "Cadet Hale," she said, "Level 3 clearance means Cadet Dax will be permitted to use his full recorded strength output, without restriction, within safety limits monitored by our medical team. This carries real risk. I need to hear you agree to this clearly, in your own words, before I grant it." I thought about my answer for exactly as long as it took to draw one steady breath. I thought about the mark beneath my name that morning, ranked last among 212 cadets. I thought about every person back home who had ever looked at me and decided, before I even opened my mouth, exactly how far I was capable of going. I thought too of Vey standing somewhere behind me, and the way his voice had cracked slightly with disbelief only moments before, as though he had already begun rewriting everything he thought he understood about my species. "I agree," I said, my voice steady despite the ache running through every part of my body. "Grant the clearance." A long, tense silence stretched across the hall as Commander Frost studied me for one final moment, then turned toward the small team of medical staff gathered near the platform, exchanging a few quiet words I could not quite hear from where I stood. One of them, a squat being with thick protective plating along her arms, gave a short nod, though her posture stayed rigid with concern the entire time. Finally, Commander Frost turned back toward the circle and raised one hand. "Level 3 clearance granted," she announced, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the massive hall. "Proceed with full caution, Cadet Dax." Korath nodded once, rolled his shoulders back a final time, and settled into a stance I had not seen him use even once that entire day, deep and low, every muscle along his massive frame visibly tightening in preparation. I planted my feet, steadied my breathing, and waited, feeling the ache in my legs and arms fade into the background, replaced by a familiar, quiet calm that had carried me through every hard match of my life. Whatever came next, I was ready for it. The moment Commander Frost dropped her raised hand, Korath moved with a force that shook the floor beneath my boots. He came in low, driving his shoulder toward my midsection in a motion built to knock the wind clean out of an opponent before they could brace properly. I twisted at the last possible second, letting his shoulder graze past my ribs rather than land squarely, absorbing only a fraction of the impact instead of the full weight behind it. Even that fraction sent a jolt of pain radiating through my side, sharp enough that my vision blurred white for half a second. I did not fall. My feet held their place inside the circle, though my breath came out in a ragged gasp that the whole hall must have heard. Korath spun quickly, faster than something his size should have been able to manage, wrapping one arm around my chest from behind and lifting with everything his massive frame could produce. My feet left the ground entirely this time, my whole body suspended a full meter above the floor, the crowd gasping loudly enough that the sound rolled through the hall like a wave crashing against rock. I twisted my hips sharply, throwing my weight backward against his center of mass rather than fighting the lift directly, a technique my old coach called breaking the anchor, something he taught me only after I had spent nearly 2 years failing to learn it properly. Korath stumbled half a step, thrown briefly off balance by the sudden shift, and in that half-second of instability, I drove my elbow down hard against his forearm, forcing his grip to loosen just enough for my feet to slam back down onto the floor. I staggered, caught myself, and planted my feet wide again, still inside the circle, though barely. A thin line of glowing light marked the boundary just centimeters behind my heels. The crowd erupted into noise, a mixture of shouting and murmuring in a dozen different languages, quickly hushed by an announcement from one of the instructors standing near the platform. I did not have time to process any of it. My chest burned with every breath, my legs trembled with fatigue that had moved past ordinary tiredness into something closer to genuine exhaustion, the kind that settles deep into muscle and refuses to leave no matter how much willpower a person throws at it. Korath straightened, breathing hard himself now, sweat soaking through the rough gray skin along his neck and shoulders. He studied me for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "You should have fallen there," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I did not," I answered, my voice hoarse but steady. He nodded slowly, then reset his stance one final time, wider and lower than anything he had attempted before. I recognized, somewhere beneath the exhaustion pulling at my body, that this was likely the last technique he had left to try. Whatever strength remained in his massive frame, he was about to commit all of it to a single, final attempt. I thought of my grandfather one more time, the memory rising unbidden through the haze of pain and fatigue clouding my thoughts. I remembered a specific afternoon, years before I ever left Earth, when I lost a match so badly that I cried afterward, ashamed and certain I would never be good enough to compete against bigger, stronger opponents. My grandfather had not offered comfort that day. He had simply knelt down, looked me in the eyes, and told me that losing taught a person more about their own strength than winning ever could, as long as they were willing to actually listen to the lesson. I had listened. I had spent years listening, training on cold mornings, absorbing losses that hurt far worse than any bruise, slowly building something inside myself that no datapad scanning height and muscle mass could ever properly measure. Korath lunged forward one final time, driving his full weight into a combined technique, gripping my shoulders while simultaneously stepping into my legs, attempting to sweep my footing out from under me, while forcing my upper body backward at the same time. It was, without question, the single most complete and powerful technique he had attempted all day. Everything he had learned across 3 full cycles of dominating this exact trial compressed into one desperate final push. I felt my balance waver, my back arching under the pressure, my vision narrowing to a single point of focus. For one terrifying second, I genuinely believed I might fall, that my feet might finally slide past the glowing edge of the circle after holding for what felt like an eternity. Then something inside me settled. The same steady calm that had carried me through every difficult match of my life. and my body responded before my mind had even finished processing the danger. I dropped my weight straight down, bending my knees fully, driving my center of gravity as low as it could possibly go, refusing the sweep entirely, by simply removing the leverage his technique depended on. Korath's momentum, built for an opponent who resisted upright, suddenly met nothing but empty air where my balance should have broken. He stumbled forward, his own weight betraying him for the first time all day, his massive frame tilting hard to one side as he fought desperately to correct his footing. He failed. Korath Dax, champion of the immovable stance for 3 full cycles, staggered 2 full steps backward, arms pinwheeling briefly for balance, and crossed the glowing edge of the circle himself. The hall fell into a silence so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, each beat impossibly loud in the sudden absence of any other sound. Then, all at once, the silence broke. Shouting erupted from every corner of the massive hall, a chaotic mixture of disbelief, excitement, and confusion, rolling together into something I could not fully process through the exhaustion weighing down every part of my body. Cadets pressed forward against the edges of the circle, craning their necks, some already talking rapidly among themselves, others simply staring in open shock. I caught a glimpse of Vey near the front of the crowd, both hands pressed against the sides of his hairless head, his mouth open in what I could only assume was his species' version of a shout. I remained standing inside the circle, my legs trembling beneath me, my chest heaving with each ragged breath, barely able to process what had actually happened. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a distant, exhausted voice reminded me that I was still standing, still inside the glowing boundary, still exactly where I had planted my feet at the very beginning of this trial. Korath straightened slowly from where he had stumbled outside the circle, glancing down at his own feet with an expression of genuine confusion, as if his body had betrayed some fundamental law of the universe he had trusted his entire life. He looked back up at me, and for a long moment, neither of us said anything at all. Commander Frost stepped forward quickly, raising both hands to quiet the chaotic noise still rolling through the hall. It took nearly a full minute before the crowd settled enough for her voice to carry clearly across the space. "Trial complete," she announced, her voice carrying a note of genuine astonishment that she did not bother hiding. "Cadet Dax has left the marked circle. Cadet Hale remains within its boundary." She paused, letting those words settle fully over the silent hall, then turned to look directly at me, her expression somewhere between disbelief and something that looked almost like pride. "For the first time in 3 full cycles," she said, "the immovable stance trial ends with a new result." I stood there, swaying slightly on legs that no longer felt entirely steady beneath me, staring back at 211 cadets who had watched me get placed dead last that very morning. My chest still burned with every breath. My arms ached down to the bone. Sweat soaked through my uniform, and I was fairly certain I would feel every single moment of this trial in my muscles for days afterward. But I was still standing, still inside the circle, exactly where I had planted my feet from the very beginning. Korath walked slowly back toward me, his heavy footsteps echoing across the now quiet hall. He stopped a few paces away, studying me with an expression I finally recognized clearly for what it was. Respect. Earned, not given. "I have never been moved from that circle," he said quietly, his voice carrying only far enough for those nearest to us to hear clearly. 3 cycles. 200 cadets each cycle, not once. "There is a first time for everything," I said, my voice hoarse but steady, allowing myself the smallest hint of a tired smile. Something shifted across his rough, stone-like face, an expression I had not seen from him at any point that entire day. It took me a moment to recognize it clearly through my own exhaustion. Korath Dax, champion of the immovable stance, was smiling. News of that trial spread through the academy faster than any official announcement ever could. By the time I finally made it back to my quarters that evening, limping slightly and cradling my right arm against my chest, cadets I had never spoken to were already stopping in the hallways to stare as I passed, some whispering to each other, others simply watching in open curiosity. I did not mind the attention as much as I expected to. Mostly, I just wanted to sit down somewhere quiet and let my body finally rest. A medical officer met me at the entrance to the barracks, a small, efficient being with 6 thin arms who ran a scanner over my shoulders, arms, and back, before declaring that nothing had been seriously damaged, only deeply strained muscles that would need at least 2 full days of proper rest to recover. I thanked her, accepted a small container of pain relief gel, and made my way toward my assigned bunk, grateful for the relative silence of the empty hallway. I did not get much silence as it turned out. Milo Turner, one of the other two humans accepted into that cycle, was waiting for me outside my quarters, arms crossed, a wide grin spread across his face that he clearly could not contain. Milo was tall for a human, lean and quick, ranked somewhere in the middle of the pack that morning, though after today, I suspected his ranking would be the last thing anyone in that hall remembered about him. "You could have warned me," he said as I approached, shaking his head slowly. "I nearly fell over watching that. Half the hall thought you were going to get seriously hurt." I was a little worried about that myself, I admitted, allowing myself to finally relax slightly, now that the trial was well behind me. "They are already talking about moving the rankings," Milo continued, falling into step beside me as I made my way toward my bunk. "Frost pulled up the historical records right after you left. Nobody has ever ended that trial the way you did. Not once, in over 200 cycles." I did not know quite what to say to that, so I said nothing at all, simply nodding as I sat down heavily on the edge of my bunk, finally allowing the full weight of my exhaustion to settle over me now that I no longer needed to hold myself upright in front of an audience. Over the following days, the story of that trial continued to spread, growing slightly with each retelling, the way stories always seem to do. By the end of the week, cadets from other intake groups were approaching me in hallways and dining halls, asking questions about Earth, about human training methods, about whether every human trained the way I apparently had. I answered honestly each time, explaining that I was simply one person who had trained hard for many years, not some special example of what every human could achieve without effort. Commander Frost called me into her office 3 days after the trial, once the medical staff cleared me for light activity again. Her office was smaller than I expected, simple and functional, with a single window overlooking the training grounds far below. "Your file listed no exceptional combat training," she said, studying a datapad in her hands as I settled into the chair across from her desk. "Standard education. Standard physical development records, nothing that should have predicted what happened in that hall. I trained outside of school," I explained. "Wrestling, mostly. Family tradition, more than anything official." She looked up from the datapad, studying me carefully for a long moment. "Your species has been underestimated for a very long time," she said finally. Not maliciously, simply because the data available painted an incomplete picture. Soft skin, fragile bones compared to most recorded species, slower reflexes on paper. "Data does not always tell the whole story," I said. "No," she agreed, a small, thoughtful smile crossing her face. "It rarely does." She informed me that day that the Academy planned to update their intake evaluation process, incorporating trained skill and technique alongside raw physical measurements for future cycles. "My trial," she explained, "had exposed a gap in their sorting system that nobody had bothered questioning in over 2 centuries, simply because no cadet had ever managed to prove that gap existed so clearly before." I found Korath Dax 2 days later, sitting alone near the edge of the training grounds, watching a group of younger cadets practice basic stances under the supervision of a junior instructor. He noticed my approach immediately, though he did not rise from where he sat. "Your arm is healed," he observed, studying the way I moved as I sat down beside him. "Mostly," I said, "still sore in the mornings." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the cadets below us struggle through their drills, some clearly more naturally gifted than others, all of them still far from anything resembling real skill. "I have thought about that trial every day since it happened," Korath said eventually, his rough voice quieter than I had heard it before. "I do not fully understand how you held against me. My strength readings have not changed. I am not weaker than I was 3 cycles ago." "You are not weaker," I agreed. "I was just harder to move than you expected." He turned to look at me directly, something thoughtful settling behind his dark eyes. "Would you teach me," he asked, "your training methods, the stance work, whatever it is that let you hold your ground against strength that should have ended the contest in seconds?" I had not expected that request, though looking back on it now, perhaps I should have. Korath Dax had built his entire identity around being the strongest cadet at that academy, and our trial had shown him, clearly and undeniably, that strength alone had limits he had never previously considered. "I can teach you what I know," I said. "It will not be quick. Most of what I learned took years to build properly." "I have time," he said simply. We began training together the following week, a strange sight that drew curious stares from cadets passing by the training grounds each morning. A massive being from a heavy gravity world, practicing basic stance work and balance techniques, alongside a human roughly a third his size, both of us equally focused, equally serious about the work in front of us. The early sessions were slow and often frustrating for him. Korath was used to solving problems through sheer force, and the patient, deliberate footwork I taught him felt foreign to a body built for overwhelming power rather than balance. More than once, he grew visibly annoyed with himself, muttering under his breath in his own language after stumbling through a simple drill that a much smaller cadet could manage easily. I never rushed him. My old coach had never rushed me either, and I understood, better than most, how much patience real change actually required. Word of our arrangement spread quickly, and within a month, a handful of other cadets had begun asking to join our sessions, curious about training methods that emphasized technique and leverage over raw physical measurements alone. Among them was Sella Voss, a quick, sharp-eyed cadet from a species built for speed rather than strength, who told me on her first morning that she had spent her entire life being told her body was built wrong for real combat training. She proved, within a matter of weeks, exactly how wrong that assumption had been. Commander Frost eventually approved a small, informal training group, meeting 3 mornings each week, open to any cadet interested in learning skills that the standard academy curriculum had never properly addressed. I found myself, somewhat unexpectedly, in a position I had never imagined occupying when I first walked into that sorting hall ranked dead last among 212 cadets. I was no longer simply the smallest, softest-looking cadet at the academy. I had become, in a quiet and gradual way, someone other cadets sought out for guidance, human and alien alike. None of this changed who I fundamentally was. I still trained every single morning, pushing through fatigue and soreness the same way I always had, refusing to let a single good trial convince me that the work was somehow finished. My grandfather had taught me that lesson long before I ever left Earth, and it remained just as true here among the stars as it had been back home on a training mat that smelled like hay and diesel fuel. 3 months after that first trial, the Academy held its next full sorting evaluation, incorporating the new assessment methods that Commander Frost had promised to implement. I stood in a very different position that day, no longer at the very back of a long line, no longer marked with the lowest possible rank among my fellow cadets. But rank, I had learned, was never really the point. The point was standing your ground when everyone around you expects you to fall, and discovering, often to your own surprise, exactly how much you are actually capable of carrying. Korath stood beside me that day, no longer looking at me the way he had during our very first trial together. We had become something closer to equals by then, 2 cadets from vastly different worlds who had learned, through hard and honest effort, that strength comes in more forms than any single measurement could ever properly capture. Somewhere behind us, a new group of cadets waited nervously for their own rankings to be announced, unaware of exactly how much those numbers were about to change over the coming cycles. I remembered standing exactly where they now stood, marked last, underestimated, quietly certain that the data on a screen had never once told the whole story of what I was capable of becoming. I hoped, watching them, that at least a few of them would discover the same thing I had discovered in that circle of pale light, months earlier. Being placed last never means staying there. 6 months after that first trial, a message arrived at the Academy that changed the shape of everything I thought I understood about my place among the stars. It came through official channels, addressed to Commander Frost, though word of its content spread through the cadet halls within hours, the way important news always seemed to travel faster than anyone officially intended. A neighboring outpost, one belonging to a species known throughout the Combine for their long-standing skepticism toward newer member worlds, had requested a formal demonstration. They wanted to see, with their own eyes, whether the story circulating about a human cadet who had ended Korath Dax's 3-cycle winning streak carried any real weight, or whether it had simply grown into exaggeration through repeated retelling. Commander Frost called me into her office once again, this time with Korath already seated across from her desk when I arrived. She explained the situation plainly, the way she always did, without softening anything or dressing it up as more important than it actually was. "They are sending observers," she said. "Senior instructors from their own training program. They have expressed doubt that a human, ranked last according to standard measurements, could genuinely have withstood full level 3 engagement from a cadet of Korath's strength category." "They think it was staged," Korath said, a low growl of irritation creeping into his voice. "They think it may have been," Commander Frost corrected carefully. "Skepticism is not an accusation. It is simply caution from people who have not yet seen the evidence themselves." I sat with that for a moment, turning the situation over in my mind the way I used to turn over a difficult match before stepping onto the mat. Part of me understood their doubt completely. If someone had told me, before I ever left Earth, that a human my size could hold ground against a being built by a world with double standard gravity, I might have doubted it myself. When do they arrive? I asked. 9 days, Commander Frost said. They have requested a repeat demonstration, under full observation, with independent monitoring equipment of their own choosing. Korath turned to look at me, something steady and unshaken in his expression. I will stand across from you again, he said, whenever they ask. I know, I said. I was not planning on saying no either. The 9 days that followed passed differently than I expected. I trained harder than I had in months, not out of fear that the outcome might change, but because I understood, more clearly than ever, that this was no longer only about me. Somewhere across the stars, an entire species was quietly deciding what kind of judgment to pass on every human who might follow the same path I had taken to reach this academy. I thought about that responsibility often during those long mornings, running through familiar drills until my body moved through them without conscious thought. Sella and the rest of our small training group offered to help however they could, running drills alongside me during our regular sessions, though we all understood clearly that this particular trial belonged to me and Korath alone. Milo, ever practical, spent one evening simply sitting with me while I iced my shoulders, saying very little, offering the kind of quiet company that did not require conversation to feel useful. On the morning the observers arrived, the sorting hall filled again, though this time the crowd looked different. Alongside the familiar faces of my fellow cadets stood a small delegation of visitors, tall and severe-looking, wrapped in dark ceremonial cloth that marked their rank within their own training hierarchy. They watched everything with an expression of careful, guarded neutrality, giving nothing away as Commander Frost welcomed them formally, before gesturing toward the circle at the center of the hall. I stepped into that circle for the second time, feeling considerably steadier than I had during the first trial, though the weight of the moment pressed just as heavily against my chest. Korath stepped in across from me, offering a small nod that carried more meaning between the two of us than any lengthy speech could have managed. The visiting observers activated their own monitoring equipment, small devices that hovered silently around the edges of the circle, recording every detail with a level of scrutiny far beyond anything used during the original trial. I understood, watching them work, that nothing about this contest would be left open to doubt once it concluded. Commander Frost raised her hand. Begin. Korath moved first this time, testing me carefully rather than committing immediately to his full strength, clearly mindful of the watching observers and unwilling to give them any reason to suspect the contest had been arranged in advance. I met each of his early attempts with the same steady footwork I had spent 6 months refining, holding my ground through techniques that would have easily ended the contest against nearly any other cadet in that hall. The trial stretched on longer than the observers had apparently expected, judging by the way several of them leaned forward, murmuring quietly to each other in a language none of us understood. Korath escalated gradually, moving through each level of clearance with visible effort, until finally, nearly 3 minutes into the contest, he committed to the same combined technique that had ended our very first trial together. I met it the same way I had before, dropping my weight low, removing the leverage his technique depended on, refusing to let momentum carry me past the boundary that mattered. Korath staggered, caught himself this time rather than stumbling fully out of the circle, and stepped back, breathing hard, a note of genuine satisfaction crossing his rough features despite the trial not ending in quite the same dramatic fashion as before. He held, Korath announced to the watching observers, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. Full clearance, no adjustment, no arrangement beforehand. The lead observer, a tall figure with pale silver eyes, studied the readings from their monitoring equipment for a long moment before finally turning to address Commander Frost directly. The reports were accurate, she said simply, her tone carrying the weight of someone unaccustomed to admitting error. We extend our apology for the doubt. Commander Frost accepted the apology graciously, though I noticed the small, satisfied smile she allowed herself once the observers had turned their attention back toward the circle, studying me with an expression that had shifted, quite visibly, from skepticism into something closer to genuine curiosity. That evening, word spread that the observers intended to bring their findings back to their own training program, along with a formal recommendation to reconsider how their instructors evaluated new cadets from lesser-known worlds. I did not know, standing exhausted in that hall for the second time in 6 months, exactly how far the effects of that single afternoon would eventually travel. I only knew that something important had shifted, quietly and permanently, in how the wider Combine understood what a human cadet, trained properly and given a fair chance, was actually capable of achieving. Korath found me later that night, sitting alone near the edge of the training grounds much the way I had found him months earlier. He settled down beside me without a word, watching the same quiet darkness settle over the academy grounds that I had been watching for the better part of an hour. They will remember this day, he said eventually, not just because you held again, because you did it without needing it to prove anything to yourself. I thought about that for a long moment before answering. I already knew what I could do, I said. Today was just for everyone else. Koreth nodded slowly, a low rumbling sound of agreement rising from somewhere deep in his chest. Last place, he said, almost to himself, shaking his head slightly. They placed you last. They did, I agreed. They will not make that mistake again, he said. I looked out over the quiet training grounds, thinking of my grandfather back on Earth, of cold mornings on a training mat that smelled like hay and diesel fuel, of every person who had ever looked at me and decided, before I opened my mouth, exactly how far I was capable of going. Rank had never told the whole story. It never would. But standing your ground, when the whole universe expected you to fall, told a story that no datapad could ever erase.